Hello, everybody. Welcome to What is Truth? Part 100. We've reached a milestone and we've been punctual. So there's something to be said for at least our capacity to be well behaved in that regard. Yes, so here we are. I'm John Barnwell and I'm north of Detroit, Detroit, the Straits. And I'm here with Pastor David William Parry in the city of London in merry old England. So how are you there?
Well, as I say, good to be with you, 100th old timer fellow. I've just done an hour and a half preaching on the online Persian Christian Fellowship with the online Persian Christian Fellowship. My wonderful brothers and sisters, some of whom are based here, some of whom are based in a country going through lots of problems at the minute. Hope springs eternal. Yeah, I mean, I'm flabbergasted. My ghast has never been so flabbered at the sheer record we've clocked up. It's a pleasure doing business with you, John. I think we've made a bit of a dent, a bit of a headway. The show is a great pleasure. It's not simply a show. It's not simply a chinwag. It's an exchange of views. It's exploring topics. It's chums, literally chums having a chinwag. It's great. I'm okay today, even though we've got loads of problems with the conference. I hear America is basically on the verge of civil war and closing down into a demilitarized zone, which is largely why one of my American speakers can't come, which is not good, but you live with it, and health has been an issue too. I mean, the conference is a couple of weeks away. That bloody Nephilim anthropology is beginning to feel like there's a force working against us. I mean, certainly I can use his name because he's a mate of mine. Johan is now convinced he's having terrible nightmares from these evil buggers. Who knows? But it's the run up to what will be our third get together. I've big plans for next year. I want it to be a weekend long event and hopefully ensconced at the University of Glasgow. There's a big story behind that. Maybe we're getting somewhere, maybe we're not. Are we any closer to what are the Nephilim? Rather like this show, are we any closer to the truth? Well, the answer is yes and no, because those are not the appropriate types of questions to ask about such subjects. So, okay, a bit overstressed at the minute, but largely in one piece and swallowing the last vestiges of the piece of chocolate I had a moment ago to get my energy back. How are you, John?
Yes, well, I'm doing well, but I hear you. There's a certain global consternation floating around, to say the least. And so I'm going to share a quote from Rudolf Steiner that I've shared before, but it's good to hear these things over and over again because they work into your soul in very unique ways if they're taken up in the right mood of soul. And so Rudolf Steiner says, we must eradicate from the soul all fear and terror of what comes toward us out of the future. We must acquire serenity in all feelings and sensations about the future. We must look forward with absolute equanimity to everything that may come. And we must think only that whatever comes to us is given to us by a world directive full of wisdom. It is part of what we must learn in this age, namely, to live out of pure trust, without any security in existence, trust in the ever-present help of the spiritual world. Truly, nothing else will do if our courage is not to fail us. And let us seek the awakening from within ourselves every morning and evening. End quote. And you can't add much more than that as far as what one must needs do to try and maintain some sense of equilibrium in these challenging times. There's people all over doing things that today will be unmentionable because everybody else is already talking about it. So we'll steer our, as David likes to call it, our chin wag in a different direction. And because, as Rudolf Steiner says At the Gates of Spiritual Science, from September 4th, 1906, above all, you must get rid of the notion that your opinion is worth more than that of other people. Self-knowledge is one of the hardest things to acquire, and it is precisely those who think they know themselves best who are most likely to be deceived. They think too much about themselves. You should get out of the habit of fixing your attention on yourself and constantly using the word I think, I believe, I consider this right. Above all, you must get rid of the notion that your opinion is worth more than that of other people. Suppose, for instance, that someone is very clever. If he displays his cleverness in the company of people who are not so clever, his behavior will be very ill-timed. He will be doing it only to please his egoism. He ought to adapt his response to the needs and capacities of others. There you had it.
Yeah, but you caught me in a sort of Zen-like mood today, I confess that. I'm trying to remember the name of a poet. Ramanujan keeps coming to mind, but it's not that. He was a philosopher. I was told a couple of years back by a Latin American sociologist that in my day at university, we never looked at comparative texts. We never looked at non-white cultures, to which I replied, yes, I remember with great delight reading the scriptures, the sutras of Ramanujan. It did manage to shut him up, thank God. And I did find great pleasure in them. There was a priest of Kali, not Tagore, and his name was at the back of my mind, who would have agreed with Steiner 100%. I mean, he realized he was on an unusual path when he was walking to one of the lakes. The story's right at the back of my mind. As a storm was approaching, and suddenly a flock of flamingos took to flight, and he literally passed out with the sheer beauty of what was in front of him. That strikes me as exactly what Steiner's talking about. Curiously, I was discussing that with the Persians a minute ago. What's happened to Christianity? The schools, everyone's become a schoolman. I'm right, you're wrong, this is why, which is simply not how the second and third century Christians discuss themselves. That's not how they describe themselves. They didn't describe themselves in terms of school, but in terms of hospital, with Jesus Christ as the great physician and the wisdom teacher. And, is it about scoring doctrinal points and correcting somebody else's dogma? Well, for them, it wasn't. It was about working on your relationships with other people. And are those things important if you're at the university, which of course they had in those days? Yes, but that's not the calling of a Christian. The calling of a Christian is to have a great big warm heart and a clear and educated mind. That was the duty of a Christian. And are you loving your neighbor as yourself? That's the duty. And if your church isn't doing that, then your church is doing the wrong thing. And I can't help thinking that actually we're becoming more obsessed with the schoolman mindset, what you lusciously call abstract ideas, abstract knowledge, which is all about point scoring nowadays. I've got a note of them here because I'm going to write something against them shortly. The thing that's getting up my nose this week, the so-called clobber passages. All you gay bastards are wrong and going to hell, and this is why. Genesis 1, Genesis 19, Leviticus 18, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6, Timothy 1, and Jude 6. Actually, two of those don't count. Ha! Genesis 1 doesn't count. Male and female made he them. How is that against LGBT people, for God's sake? So I estimated at 5, not 7. 7 in the entire Bible. Grow up, Christians. You know, and also, if you look at the context of the time, which no one ever does, or you have revolutionary thoughts like, is that the last word God is ever going to say on that particular topic? What about the Holy Spirit? Is the Holy Spirit gone numb? You know, has it lost its voice? So, right, that's what a writer said back then. Maybe it's not what he'd say now, you know, with all this extra knowledge floating around. You know, and oh my God, let's not get into the fact, of course, that no one could afford to produce a sheet of paper until about the 4th century, or indeed you needed a network of scribes to transliterate everything. Let's not forget that. But, you know, and then you had all the translators had a particular ideological view because they were paid by somebody. You know, let's not forget all of that. Yeah, I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, what are Christians meant to do? How many times do the apostles have to say it? Because it strikes me they're saying it over and over again, and nobody's listening, because it's much more fun to actually ram something down somebody's throat than work at a relationship with them. So that's how I'm feeling at the minute. Abstract knowledge. No, we need Zen, and we need hard Bible reading. Handing back to you, John.
Well, it's good to see you get a little worked up on the soapbox, the theological soapbox. Of course, it's organic soap.
Of course.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a bigger view that Rudolf Steiner would frequently point at. And in past episodes, since this is episode 100, it wouldn't be a bad idea to do a summation of certain key ideas that we think we're talking about. And I hope that somebody at least strives to understand what we think we mean before they filter it through what they think it means. And that's what we all do, isn't it? Because we take this daily use sense of personality and we use that as a filter. And our higher I is working in us unconsciously, the Kyrios, as I've made reference to on many occasions, our relationship to the Lord, the Christ in you that St. John talks about. But there's an interesting passage, a few passages in Rudolf Steiner's Mystery Knowledge series, Collected Works 232 from October 23rd, 1923, that he gave just before the big conference. And this particular image that he gives is so powerful. I thought I'd share it. It just came to my mind just before we came on. So it has the sense of spontaneity here. And so he says, and I quote, "Now, if you expect that it is only necessary to look right or left and see a cloudy form as your astral body, you will be disappointed. For it does not happen in that way. You must pay attention to what really does occur. What may really occur is, for example, that after a time through such experiences, you may gradually see the dawn in a new way. You may have a new feeling during sunrise. Gradually, along this path, you will come to experience the warmth of the dawn as something of a prophetic nature, as if it were announcing something, as if the dawn had a natural prophetic force in itself. You will begin to feel the dawn as spiritually forceful, and you will be able to connect an inner meaning with this prophetic force, so that you get a feeling, which you might at first regard as an illusion, that the dawn is related to your own being. Through such experiences, as I have described to you, may gradually bring yourself into a condition in which you feel when you see the dawn does not leave me alone. It is not merely yonder while I am here. I am inwardly united with this dawn. It is a quality of my own inner feeling. I myself at this moment am the dawn. When you feel thus united with the dawn, so that you yourself experience, as it were, the color, radiation, and shining, the appearance of the sun from out of the colors and the light, so that in your own heart, a sun arises, as it were, out of the morning glow as a living feeling. Then you will also feel as if you yourself are traveling with the sun over the vault of heaven. You will feel that the sun does not leave you alone. The sun is not there while you are here, but you feel that your existence extends in a certain sense to the sun existence, and that you travel with the light throughout the day. Whew.
Look, you've got to remember, I've just come for an hour and a half preaching. Rudolf Steiner, his worth and significance is nearly incalculable, because he drags the Western mystery tradition into modern times. And there's so much more to anthroposophy, this will sound wrong, than just that. So as a select group of ideas, he modernizes at the very, very least. But as a cultural movement surrounding those ideas, that is highly significant. And the fact he has refused that level of respect, I still find absolutely astonishing. And it's certainly nothing done by the Anthroposophical Society, this or anywhere else. It strikes me they're being very honest and upfront about sort of the materials that we've inherited and we discuss. The fact that he's uncited so many times by people clearly using ideas either of his or directly inspired by him. The fact the name never actually reaches refereed academic papers unless it's some sort of aberration is truly appalling. And the fact no one wants to nail their academic colours to the mast and say, well, actually, this is a major scholar, no matter what else he was. I find that the duplicity of modern times. I was speaking again to the online Persians a minute ago about the old gods. The world matrix we find ourselves in. That's the modern way of putting it, isn't it? I'm not against that. If you think the ancients talked about samsara, that would be an analog. That would be a version of saying matrix. This sort of illusion that hides reality beneath. Why not call it the matrix? Let's not get po-faced about it. If that's the idea as it is discussed in modern times, okay, that's great. I prefer more classical notions, as I say, like samsara, for the simple reason it's richer and it's got a history behind it. Therefore, there are more ways of discussing it and grappling with that particular notion. But let's look at what hard facts there are. Certainly Chaucer would have said the old gods have never left the earth. They went nowhere. They've always been here and they've always ruled. And that's why Steiner's work on those traditions is so important. Not all of them were rapscallions. Is that some sort of pagan blasphemy? I'll have to think about that. Mind you, you can't have blasphemy and paganry, I think, in paganism. Let's look at what they were. So Zeus, Jupiter, power, Aphrodite, Venus, sex, Ares, Mars, war. Those gods have never gone anywhere. They've ruled this planet from the beginning. They're more than happily ruling at the moment. And it's up to us to remember that there's something beyond all of that. There's something beyond point scoring. There's something beyond reducing Christianity to a mere gambit in an intellectual chess match. There's something more to anthroposophy than a couple of weirdos, talking about, that's my favourite one, Eskimo needlework. There's a lot more to it than that. How about the use of colour in the arts the use of movement, in dance. I mean, what about all of that? But there's this sort of weird need nowadays to sort of couch things in the sort of pseudo-realistic, which I find bizarre and bewildering because that's not materialism. And it sort of protects materialism from head-on criticism. Realism and materialism have never been the same thing and they never will be. And the fact that realism turns snooty for no reason whatsoever about rival systems of thought and doesn't treat them as rival systems of thought worthy of discussion will actually lead this current society as it is to ruin. There's only one way to discuss things. There's only one way to analyze things. There's only one way to engage with reality around you and the people around you. No, I mean this. We're meant to be embracing diversity nowadays, aren't we? But that is exactly the polar opposite. What people are doing nowadays is more moribund and controlled, equicentric. What a great pseudonym! I love that. Late 14th century matrice, uterus, womb, from Old French matrice, womb, uterus, and directly from Latin matrix. Thank you very much for that, epicentric. Latin matrix, brackets, genitive matrices, close brackets, pregnant animal. My dear friend, I mean, you summed up what I wanted to say there totally. Equicentric, in late Latin womb, also source origin from mater, cognitive matrix, mother, yeah, mater mother. But not the true mother, not the father mother that's discussed in the Bible. You're looking at a false mother. You're looking at Kali. I wish I could remember this guy's name. He's a really important poet. I mean, he, as I say, as a priest of Kali, was aware that she was one of the weavers of illusion. I think the East is much better at us than that. Yeah, at those thoughts, they're much more subtle than us. We sort of know something's going on in the division of phenomena and noumena. So, from Kant, thank heavens, onwards, we've been aware that there's a veil which we can't really pierce beyond. We can't see things as they are. But these slick Eastern boys were talking about that millennia before us. And, sometimes the god forms, I'm not going to commit. Right, are there 330 gods in Hinduism, or is there one? That's a moot point. And certainly, some types of Hinduism are exactly what we're talking about. They're directly analogous to Abrahamism. So I don't want to get into this endlessly complex and deep-rooted discussion because that could go on forever. But certainly as a priest of Kali, he was hoping she would point beyond the illusion to the real. And that's one of the reasons he started writing poetry. I think we've got to be, as anthroposophists, a bit more robust, dare I say, in our comparative work. I think that's where we're sort of beaten off track far too often by, let's face it, a public that largely can't care less. And we haven't woken up that public to the fact they should. That we're reducing everything to competing schools and schoolmen. I said this, no, you didn't. You said that, no, I didn't. This is what children do in a schoolyard. It's not that sort of hospitality hospital of the original Christians that were trying to work on the existential, that were trying to work on relationships, that were trying to work on what was important to the Holy Spirit, which, as I said a minute ago, is a large heart and a warm, open mind. And that is exactly what Steiner is updating in esoteric terms in our time. I don't know. For me, I couldn't get enough quotes of Steiner. I find my progress back into the world of anthroposophy, not simply Steiner, incredibly slow because this time I don't want to miss anything. It's like being on a very fast train going through the spectacular countryside. Oh my God, I missed that bit. And, sort of, I don't want that to happen again. But, it means unless there's a real balance, even on this show, we won't really deliver to people the importance of why anthroposophy should be more openly discussed and more generally discussed. I had a quick look again at Colin Wilson's book during the week, on Rudolf Steiner. I mean, I've got a grudging respect for Colin Wilson. I hate him. I hate him. Right. I mean, I don't know why, one of the angry young men, that was actually a quite necessary cultural movement at the time. The lethargy and the exhaustion of the generation before them. I mean, most of them had been young men during the war. They'd come back exhausted. They found themselves as exploited by the upper classes as they had been before they went to fight. Therefore, what would have been the point? And they were tired. And anyone that thinks they didn't have the right to be tired is just a brute and a monster. They had every right to be tired. How much more do we want from people? But that's where the angry young men come in. They see all of that and they think, no, hang on, enough's enough. This isn't acceptable. Wilson, of course, ties into the end of that sort of cultural stream. Hated, I mean, a very, very thought-provoking writer. I mean, I read The Outsider. I was amazed it was attacked in the way that it was, particularly by people who later admitted they hadn't even read the book. Please don't be so unprofessional. If you're going to say something, at least read the book first, and say, right, I don't accept it because, and now I'm going to read it. Be more honest. And certainly the occult, which is actually quite underrated. I mean, it's not anything to do directly with, I mean, it does mention that, ceremonial magic, herbs, and so on. I mean, that can be picked up in a much more sophisticated form in a number of other places. But it's some of the ideation coming from Wilson that goes along with that. I mean, I remember to this day reading that how he felt everything had gone downhill during the Ice Age, that before that time, the human organism, its senses were much more powerful and refined than they are now. And to survive the brute realities of the Ice Age, we had to sort of pull our sense world in like a snail withdrawing into its shell, because we wouldn't have survived otherwise. We had to become tough and strong to make sure our families and our friends and our community got through. And I remember reading that thinking, oh my God, even as a working hypothesis, that is staggeringly important. And it actually puts on the table a number of other things like telepathy and precognition on a scientific basis, which then deserves serious discussion. But prejudice gets in the way from the beginning. Oh, there can't be any precognition because I've got a PhD in Oxford. And this sort of nonsense must stop. We need more Steiner. We need less Colin Wilson books on Aleister Crowley, which was awful. The one on Blavatsky was nearly laughable. But no, we need to remember that even he is flattering to Rudolf all the way through, and there's a reason behind that. It's not just because he likes the guy. What do you think, John?
Yeah, Colin Wilson, I mean, he made actually quite major inroads into bringing a wider audience to the field of esoterica in all the various genres he attempted to address. I see him in a way like a little more modern Montague Summers. I know Montague's your guy. Yeah, he's got that. You mentioned the way he's been treated, and you mentioned, of course, Rudolf Steiner, and it's like Rudolf Steiner suffers what Gerald Massey called the orthodox conspiracy of silence. They don't even approach it. It's actually quite intimidating. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's comment to Owen Barfield, and I'm just paraphrasing, that he realized what it was, but it was too late. He wasn't prepared to start over. And it is that kind of intimidating contribution, is so that, when you got somebody who's done 6,000 lectures, and if you dig in long enough, you come to realize that they're internally cohesive throughout his body of work. Oh, okay. He's internally cohesive throughout over 6,000 lectures and 50 articles and books and all that, and that if he was just making this up, that in and of itself would be one of the greatest achievements in all the history of literature, period, because trying to tell me what you had for breakfast 2 days ago, to be able to weave all of that, it gives one a confidence that he's speaking out of realities, as he says. And you can even see it in lectures where he's talking and he's clairvoyantly looking into the Akashic record, into the past, and then he'll say, "Oh, now I see." So he's come across something in the Akashic record that was a new perception on his part. So you see that when you realize that he would go to the lecture, he'd go up to the podium, he'd have maybe one note card with 2 names with their birth dates and another keyword or 2, and then lecture for an hour, hour and a half. So when you look at the details, and like Douglas likes to say, he went into it and he tried to find mistakes. And many times you'll come across something, you'll think it's a mistake, and then you'll blithely realize later on that you just didn't understand what he was saying. So I challenge anybody to take that up. But yeah, academia. Well, I had a friend who was a sculptor. He has like major sculptures in the city of Detroit, huge things, right? But there was these shows, the art shows that were going on, and there was all the intelligentsia of the art community in Detroit. And they didn't invite him because he didn't have a master's degree. And so it's this whole defensive mechanism that contributes towards the way they get treated in academia. And so it's like this private club and you ain't in it, it's like, and so I've seen that many times, of course, because I'm just an autodidact. I mean, yeah, I did some school, but I wasn't impressed with what they were coming up with. And I became a book collector and then eventually world-known antiquarian in esoteric studies and ancient cultures and history of ideas and all that kind of stuff with all the years that I was at the Mayflower Bookshop, which was the largest collection of that kind of material in the world. And so we had all these people coming through, original authors and gurus and priests. And we used to have this great priest who collected tarot cards, and he would just swoon at the mention of the name of the Virgin Mary, so as such a variety of people came through there. And what I always looked for, and it's interesting because I just happened to glance on Valentin Tomberg's preface to his book on the tarot, and that's a different path. That's not anthroposophy, and he tries to be very clear about that, although he did write some things along the lines of Rudolf Steiner's work early on, but he moved on and became what you might say a neo-Hermetic Catholic or neo-Catholic Hermetic, or however you want to derive your descriptive. But in there, he said that there was a tendency in modern times that there's the thinking, the feeling, and the will, and that the modern time is tending towards thinking and will devoid of feeling. And it's that feeling, that's that whole thing about the quotation I read about the sun, gathering in the sun in your heart space. Because if you look at what Steiner says elsewhere, and I've discussed this, is that the astral you could see is the light that streams from the stars, and the etheric as the blueness of the sky, and in which that light moves through and becomes apparent. And so you'll see that we're within the light mantle of the sun. In fact, the solar wind goes all the way out to Saturn. The planet Saturn is a ring pass knot, and then comes back. It has like this elasticity, so to speak, or reflective nature. And that actually, in that context, we're inside of the sun. And so that's an interesting thing. And you get to the point there's a level of consciousness that Rudolf Steiner talks about where one is so open in the realm of the heart that at any point in the day you'll know where the sun is, no matter what time of night. Even were you to wake up and you didn't have a clock, you'd know where the sun is. So that's the whole idea of the sun behind the sun, the midnight sun, as it's called. And so you have this relationship between Earth and the sun that is so dynamic when you consider that Christ is referred to as the solar logos, and so that the divine spiritual beings were together when the Earth and the moon and the sun were all together as one unit, and then the sun separated off and the spirits of form went with it, the exousiae and higher beings, so that they would have an arena of activity. And then the Elohim exousiae carried off the moon out of the Lemurian period. And so it removed those unredeemed aspects that were not to be involved. And as this event happened, that brought into being the division of the sexes, which happened really before the physical world was even happening for humanity at that time. And so you have the different stories of the creation stories in Genesis, so that you have one pertaining to that earlier event, and then you have the one pertaining to the Adam and Eve story, which is referring to the physical coming forth in the Lemurian period. And so there's many facets of this that could be approached as meditative content. But again, it's that the future tendency, like Vincent Tomberg said, of the intellect and the will without that force of the heart.
My better half has just reminded me that the Hindu poet was called Ramprasad Sen, who is well worth reading, a master, by a bard by any description. And as I say, a priest of Kali, sort of very, very interesting combination there. Oh, God, you said so much. I'm spending a lot of time at the moment looking at Richard Hoagland. I don't know if you've ever met him or come across him. Not idly, because of course at the back of my mind is who's still alive and who can we get to the conference next year, and who's sympathetic to anthroposophical ideas and who isn't. I notice they're always flirting, these sort of first generation truth seekers, with esoteric or occult ideas, but never, at least it seems to me, excuse me a second, at least it seems to me, willing to get their hands dirty and actually do anything about it. So I came across a lecture of his on Mars and Aleister Crowley, which I thought was actually extremely interesting, a bit strained in certain places, but overall very interesting. I mean, his work on the moon. I mean, we were looking at that today, just before lunch, and it got me thinking. No, at the very least, there's an analogical intelligence at work there, joining dots and making suggestions. I mean, and clearly he has a background. I mean, he's not simply some guy just standing up and, oh, Agatha Velvet, you've met Richard Hoagland. I'm totally jealous. I'd love to. Because he's one of those people that suggests things. And he's also very careful to say that all the way through. I don't know. It strikes me there's a necessity for anthroposophy. That said, have you ever read The Goatfoot God by Diane Fortune, John?
Yes, I've read all of her stuff.
Well, don't take this the wrong way. You remind me of Jelks in The Goatfoot God, the sort of antiquarian bookseller with a massive collection of books, who should have become a priest but didn't. So, and that's said with great warmth and love. You just reminded me of him for the last couple of weeks, and I remembered that character. Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm one of the priests that's included in your list of memorable bumpings. As I say, I do hope to see you in person one of these days.
Secrets of Dr. Tavener.
I like Florence. I thought Crowley's poem about Sapphish was just cruel, and right.
He's a
Funny.
bully.
Hmm?
He's a bully.
Oh, he's a bully and he doesn't hide it.
I remember I asked, I was at dinner with Timothy Leary one time, and I asked him what he thought of Crowley, and he said, "Oh, too much of that Teutonic macho BS." He says, he said he preferred Gurdjieff, and he said, in fact, his favorite Gurdjieff book was Boyhood with Gurdjieff. It's about a guy who was actually a boy at the Center for the Harmonious Development of Man. And I think that's a really interesting book. That the gentleman, I can't think of his name right now, but he wrote 2 books on Gurdjieff. Of course, people like to say Gurdjieff, but it's Gurdjieff. And but he, again, it brings up that issue of the will, see, because his particular methodology was pertaining to the will. And it was in a large part with him directing the will of the people that were at his school. And consequently, both Crowley and Gurdjieff were the only 2 people I've heard of that when they went to see Rudolf Steiner, he didn't accept. He took a pass. And so what more direct statement could you make than to do something like that? And so I just think that there's a great disagreement in methodology in that whole idea, because that's part of the troubles that Rudolf Steiner developed later in life, was after he gave the lecture cycle From Jesus to Christ, where he showed the difference between the careful preservation of the Christ principle by the Rosicrucians, the true Rosicrucians, and the amplification of the Jesus principle as represented by the Jesuit order. And he shows the distinction between the 2 of them. And that wasn't really appreciated, but true nonetheless. And so when you get into the machinations that go on behind the scenes, there's a great many plots and subplots and all of that going on. But now we're living in an era where we have a Pope who's a member of the Jesuit order. And so that's problematic, because he's into, like, moving into the social sphere, as being like the church become like social workers, which I can understand the principle of sacrifice, but this has to do with the context of the control that's involved and the centralized. It's almost a Mongol impulse, that whole idea of centralization, at least the way Rudolf Steiner describes the way in which the whole concept of kingship and the emperor came to Europe. It was actually something that streamed to Europe from the Mongols. And if you look at the history of our relationship to the Mongol Empire, you'll see, like with Marco Polo going there, and the whole idea that the early connection of the church, specifically through the Jesuits, with China. And people always like to describe it like that they were taking Jesus to China. But really, what happened was that the Jesuits brought back the Mongol impulse to Europe. It's the opposite of what people think. And there's a very ancient Atlantean knowledge basis within Chinese culture, because the Mongolians were the 7th period of Atlantis. So that's that actually very advanced, but it's devoid of the Christ impulse. And that's an important consideration. While there are certain aspects of it that leave a place where the Christ impulse can be interpreted into. But if you get into, like, for example, you mentioned the Kali priest, and that is akin to that whole Shivite impulse. But within the Greco tradition, you could see the similar image of Hecate or Hecate, as she's described in Shakespeare, and that she's a triple goddess, and she has these things, a torch, and she has a rope, and all of these devices that represent an ordering of a threefold nature, and she's considered the goddess of magic for that sake. And so there's this whole idea that's very much akin to that whole Kali impulse. But you see that Rudolf Steiner tries to be very clear when he says it's well and good to study ancient cultures. It's very helpful, and one can find a resonance at one point in one's life with one tradition or another, but that the Christ impulse is unique because it's something that occurs in time. It happened at a particular point in time in which Christ incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth. And so it's not this like timeless, everything is everything, a type of vantage point that's so popular in New Age circles, but that it's a mystery of time. And the more we learn the language of this mystery of time, the more we'll be able to enter into the works of Rudolf Steiner.
According to Minister Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam, I actually exchanged emails with him a couple of years back. We were running something at the time called Extremist Club, and they've got a mosque down Brixton Way. And I'd come across one of the young imams who had a very good rendition of Ave Maria. But it struck me he couldn't hold his own in a debate for half an hour. So I said, well, do you know anyone else, with respect, do you know anyone else that can come and talk about the Nation of Islam, black racism, and so on? Because we've got to remember, in that system, all white people are evil and were simply put together at the last minute by the evil Yaqub, who, of course, is their version of the prophet Jacob. Although they're right on one level, I mean, he was a trickster. They're very good at spotting the fact he was a trickster. It ended going right the way up the scale until I was talking to Minister Farrakhan himself, and I ended up having to give this grovelly email saying, "Look, Minister Oswald Spengler, everyone forgets that." Oh yeah, you're quite right. Yeah, the Nation of Islam is a UFO cult. They do forget that, and they are. Yeah. It went, so I ended up saying to him, look, Minister Farrakhan, I'm sure you're used to 5-star travel. Oswald, among other things, of course, let's not go down that route. So I'm sure you're used to, 5-star hotels and travel. We're a small philosophical society debating group. We can't afford to pay you. That sort of thing. And I think he was still waiting a year or so later, but we couldn't afford you, sorry. But I had the distinction of being one of the few white people they call sir at that particular mosque, which I'm very proud of. Right, clearing the air, I held this up because they're cough sweets, and I'm getting over British late summer flu, or is it early autumn flu? That's why I held that up. I also plead guilty to saying Gurdjieff, because if I say Gurdjieff, nobody knows who I'm talking about, so I plead utterly guilty to that. No.
That's okay. You're British. British always change the way they, they made Sri Lanka Ceylon. It's like,
I tried it. No, it doesn't work here. If you either go down that woke route where you're trying to find, the original pronunciation of everything, Iran, and therefore no one can follow your sentences. They simply don't know what you mean. Or you have to sort of think, oh, right, I'll just anglicize everything because at least there's some point of contact. So I opted for the latter as opposed to this bewildering woke thing, which is, there was a wonderful story going around a couple of days ago where a young guy went into a Starbucks, I think it was a Starbucks, with his good lady wife, who he introduced to the barrister as his good lady wife, to which he was told by this jumped up 17-year-old, don't you mean partner? To which he said, no, I mean wife. So, I mean, it's completely out of control in this part of the world, which is why I'm not even going to bother. Oh, no, I can go even better than that. The grammar, right, Oswald Spengler at John Barnwell, Minister Farrakhan was cancelled from a progressive Christian church in my homeland, brackets, Grand Rapids, close brackets, at the last minute for, and amongst all the other things, for being transphobic. Look, we knew he was anti-gay. The point is, this discussion went all the way up the chain. And I thought, my God, if we can if we can kidnap, for 30 minutes, the head of the Nation of Islam to talk to our group, that's newsworthy. I mean, it didn't work out because we couldn't afford him. But, the curious group beyond belief. Anyway, it's put me off now. I was talking about... John, you take over. I'm trying to remember what I was talking about. That's it, the woke brigade. I mean, you can't do it here. You can't do it here. Or as I say, you become generally incomprehensible. With regard to the rest of it, I mean, I don't know. Will my suiting of anthroposophy finally cut me off from mainstream society once and for all? Probably. It depends whether you think that's important or not nowadays, isn't it? We mustn't attack progressive Christianity for the sake of it. Am I a progressive Christian? Somebody called me a couple of years back a one-issue liberal. Yes, you all know what the issue is. I'm not going to even go into it. There may be some truth in that, I hate to admit. And I do hate to admit it because we can't just pretend the liberals and the progressives don't have anything to say. They have a great deal to say, which is not being met by the so-called traditionalists in terms of Christianity. Just to pretend other cultures and other people don't exist and that we're right and they're wrong de facto actually isn't winning an argument. It just shows a really severe level of ignorance towards other people and world culture. And whether we like it or not, we're part of a world system. Therefore, either we do have a significant worth to us or we don't, and what would that significant worth be? Handing you back, John.
Well, again, that goes back to the quote I read earlier. Above all, you must get rid of the notion that your opinion is worth more than that of other people. It's so he kind of that's a very humbling statement especially coming from someone of that stature. And if you could just maintain that, because it's not necessary for you to pass judgment on other people. If there's something that some people like to call natural law, and it has to do with the obvious nature of the golden rule, and so to speak, that Jesus, when he proclaimed the golden rule, love God with all your heart and mind and sinew, and love your neighbor as yourself. That kind of covers it. And so when you go down the list of how one might violate that dictum, that's what we're doing here, isn't it? That's the clarification of karma, because karma means action. So what are you doing? That's that will impulse. And this meditation that Rudolf Steiner gave about developing your relationship to the rising sun, it's not something that he wanted somebody to just try and stack at one abstract idea on another to try and relate to that concept, but rather it's a heart experience, that it's coming into that feeling of having a direct relationship to the being of the sun. And that is because, according to Rudolf Steiner, eventually the Earth will become a future sun, and we will be part and parcel of that transformation, that it has something to do with the actual evolutionary scheme that was laid out by Rudolf Steiner. And so this whole idea of the heart is the sun, and in astrology, the sun rules the heart. And you can look in the horoscope of somebody who has like difficult aspects, say, Uranus, Pluto, Uranus, T-square on their sun. Well, that could presage certain difficulties regarding heart problems or heart problems of the father. And you can go check this out. Like Kepler, he decided he was going to go disprove astrology because Tycho de Brahe, who was his mentor, of the Uraniborg Island in Denmark, amazing Tycho de Brahe. And so that Kepler, I wish I had to pull the quote up, but I don't have it available. I could give you the gist of it. But he said that, he attempted to disprove astrology, and he couldn't. It couldn't overcome his unfailing disbelief, and so it becomes a question. Okay, well, what is that? And then it's interesting because if you talk to astrologers and try to figure out, well, how could it be so? They tend to go into this real mechanical kind of description of why their theory about why astrology is there. But it's something that is much more readily approached from the meditation that Rudolf Steiner gave about coming into a cognitive relationship with the sun rather than just calculating through measure, number, and weight. And so it's a shift of consciousness that has to do with the transformation, because, as I've said before, the astral is that which streams to us out of the future, and the etheric, the life body, the body of memory, is that which is reflecting the past. And so you have this whole idea that the ego is riding in this chariot pulled by the horses of the thinking, the feeling, and the will. And we're riding towards the future, and we look back to the past, and what do we see? And so you have it's Arjuna riding in the chariot of the battle of Kurukshetra with Krishna riding next to him, and he's telling him the Bhagavad Gita, so it's this, as you enter into all the various versions, and I like what Tim Leary said to me about, I asked him about like the ancient mythos of India and all of that. He said it was ontologically correct, but pre-scientific. I thought, what a marvelous statement, and there's so much that he did that I totally disagree with, but nonetheless, he was a wonderful human being and a brilliant mind. And yes, that's just the thing. And Rudolf Steiner takes it a step further. He says that in the Wonders of the World lecture cycle, that in the future, people will look back on the science of today the way that scientists today look back on ancient mythology. So you have this whole idea of that. What is the context of your perception and description of reality? How are you viewing it? Are you including the supersensible? And that's why he said actually the Greek myths are more accurate regarding the cosmogony and the world conception in many ways than modern science. That modern science has reduced itself. It's a reducto ad absurdum, that they want to try and find the one rule. It's like the one ring to rule them all. Ultimately, it becomes a quest for power, because they want to, like Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam, right? Of St. Alban, he wants to torture the secrets out of Mother Nature, so it's this whole idea of that aggressive isolated intellect that's functioning within the realm of abstract thinking.
Oh, I don't think we're on the verge of that. We've actually got that already. I mean, certainly, the way universities behave nowadays, where there's no room for heresy and you're jeered out of the room. I mean, we're already back. I mean, with respect to the author I was promoting a couple of weeks ago about the neo-feudalistic, neo-feudalism resurging, we're already there. The super rich, in other words, the real aristocracy that rule everything. Nowadays, it's the academy instead of the church that as the only group of ideas we are told that can be discussed, and everything else is derided. We're already there, and the fact they smother what they would consider heretical discourse. I mean, I'm thinking of Rupert Sheldrake, who is only asking questions really about the clearly false claims made by science in certain areas. And as a mainstream scientist himself, he is not saying everything is worthless. All he's actually saying is just because science doesn't know everything, it doesn't mean it knows nothing. But at the same time, there are clear areas where it's got to stop making claims for knowledge that aren't justified. As one of my chums is Ray Tallis, one of the Cambridge atheists. It's a long story. I'll have to bore you all with it at some point. I don't know how it happened. I think it was because I wrote a poem about Ray and his work as a poet. Of course, I mean, he's an international savant, a man of immense and prodigious talents and fields of study, qualifications. I think he felt my comments, some of which were critical, were justified. But I count him as a mate, and certainly he would say, I mean, his trouble with Sheldrake is basically he's right at where science is wrong, but he's too quick to jump into alternatives. I mean, when you were talking about science being viewed by the bubbleheads of the future as an antiquated superstition nowadays, I can easily see that because it derides and it smothers genuine discourse. So we're back to medieval times with the church smothering other opinions and haranguing or murdering anyone that gets out of line. It depends how far we want to go into medievalism as opposed to whether we're actually there or not. We're there. The Jeff Bezoses of the world. I mean, we all know the names. Is it this mysterious cabal of Jewish magicians? No. It's Morgan Stanley. We know who they are. I mean, they don't hide it. It's the Rockefellers. It's the Rothschilds. If the Baron de Rothschild, if Lord Rothschild wants to call up Liz Truss, she's not going to say no, Lord Rothschild, is she? Because she'd be out of a job in seconds. Yes, my lord. No, my lord. I mean, we're back to all of that, and it's taken Britain slightly longer to acquiesce than I thought because we're all on our knees already. I mean, we never really got off them. But the rest of the world will soon be back on them with us, which is no cause for celebration. In fact, it's something we've got to fight against, but it might already be a tad too late. Which is why I'm not against progressive language. Do I find myself rather proud to be a Catholic flirting with anthroposophy? Yes. I mean, what I'm trying to do is find non-sectarian, non-denominational language that's meaningful. I mean, many of the churches in America call themselves non-denominational nowadays, but that's clearly sleight of hand. I mean, it's legerdemain. It doesn't actually mean that. What it means is I've got a very clear Bible Belt theology and I'm sticking to it, by the way. So it's a certain type of baptism. That really is not on. It's unacceptable. Say what you are and justify what you are, because don't expect other people to do that if you're not going to do it. I mean, Alex Jones says he's non-denominational, but it's clear that he's not. By the way, I think Alex Jones lost that trial recently. Have I been told correctly? I don't. I'd rather like Alex Jones. Sorry, John. Yeah.
Can't really call it a trial. I
Yeah,
mean,
remember in No Man's Land.
it's the most egregious disregard for any sense of true constitutional legal basis that it's a complete travesty. So let's not even bother going there. I think I've said what I think about that.
Yeah, I mean, remember in the third world, you only hear bits of gossip. You don't hear the whole story. So I'm very sorry to hear that, and I'm not really surprised that the case was rigged and loaded. I mean, what else could it do? And I like Alex Jones. I mean, is he uniformly correct about everything? No, he's not. He's human. Is he a rabble rouser? Yes, and he's also very entertaining. I mean, I love the world famed Justin Bieber rant to this day. And when he ends up behind his desk growling and screaming for over 30 seconds, I'm sorry, the showbiz part of me thinks that's absolutely astonishing. And the fact, of course, our mutual friend Leo is on the show. Good on you, Alex. And Ike, is he still in a job? Ike's there every now and again talking about lizards. Ike, come up with some new stuff. You've shot your bolt. We all know about the lizards now. Come up with something else. I heard recently, or have I got this the wrong way around? Because he knows now that everything's going on around it. It's all kicking off around Saturn, and the whole system is geared towards Saturn, which I think is, it's all something to do with what was it, rectangles and octagons and what have you. And I'm not sure how. Apparently, there's one gigantic thunderstorm, not my word, that shows this sort of energetic struggle around Saturn. Yeah, I just need to know what it is and who's doing it. So I suppose it's your lizards up to their chicanery again. What I mean, in terms of the real esoteric, as I say, why can't we stick to tried and trusted people like Steiner? I mean, the minute you said that we were going to be one of the new suns, certainly the Druids used to preach that. They used to teach that we were on the way to being solar beings and the Earth itself would become a new sun. And there were hints at global warming. I'm not talking about the present phenomena, whatever it is, right? I'm talking about the fact they felt the Earth throughout the millennia would warm and warm and warm until we realized we were celestial beings and the Earth was well and truly on its way to being a sun, which would reconfigure the planets in our particular vicinity. I mean, that's a Druid belief as well. To actually hear that reiterated, I think Gurdjieff actually says something somewhere about that too. I mean, that's a sort of Velikovsky style worlds in collision, living cosmos thing. I mean, that's nearly come back, and no one wants to talk about it, which I think is a travesty. Again, it's the pretense of knowledge that's going on nowadays to keep an ideology in place, and the ideology is reductive materialism that these so-called academicians of nowadays want to stay in place because they don't want their chains rattled. John?
Yeah, well, there was a so-called scientific expert, this woman, who's speaking, and she says, "We own the science." It's like, oh, really? Do you even know what science means? I mean, the whole idea of science is that it's continually under revision. So it's hard to grab onto, let alone own it. So let's just be real about that.
Oh, yeah, but that's one of those medieval statements, isn't it? I mean, the level. I mean, I think everybody knows I'm not into conspiracy theories unless they're financial, because they're so see-through. You can see them taking place in front of you nowadays. Most conspiracy theories for me don't really cut mustard. I mean, because it's not the only time they've played human society. I mean, the level of superstition in our so-called educated part of the world is nearly medieval in the worst sense of the word now. Where people question everything out of sheer pig ignorance as opposed to anything else. When you went to high school, when you went to primary school, didn't you listen to what anyone was saying? And just because they weren't saying everything you needed to know doesn't mean that it was unimportant. Did you listen to anything? The answer is clearly no. I mean, we've got to start again. Schools. I'm the last one to admit to deny. Forgive me, that schools are anything apart from control mechanisms. But let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Do we really want to lose those control mechanisms and have hordes of young men looking for trouble walking down every street? John?
Well, yeah, there was like that whole row that happened over in your neck of the woods with the Tavistock Institute having to shut down one of its facilities because of the mind manipulation that's tagged onto that institution. But if you get into that whole development, I mean, you see that the Tavistock is on a trajectory towards attempting to craft the types of thoughts that you're going to entertain. But the Tavistock exists on a piece of land that was owned by a Lord Pirbright. And everybody goes, well, okay, so, well, Lord Pirbright's interesting because that's Henry de Worms. And people don't know who that guy is, but he was a member of the Rothschild, and but he converted to Anglican, and so that's kind of interesting. And he was really tight with Lord Rosebery. Lord Rosebery was married to Hannah de Rothschild, who was the wealthiest woman in the world, next to perhaps the Tsarina of Russia or something to that effect, and so these were the financiers that were the masterminds behind the Imperial Press Conference and what led to the Tavistock Institute and the development of the intelligence community, as people like to describe it, Five Eyes and all that's an outgrowth of their activities and funding. And they were the ones who funded, along with other members of the Rothschilds, were involved with Cecil Rhodes and the whole thing that's covered in Tragedy and Hope. And people go on and on endlessly. Alex is really big into that, and as is Leo Zagami, who we done many shows with. And so, yeah, there is all of that, and how it ties into the Jesuit impulse. And Chris Strunk, who I miss greatly, who passed away recently, was one of the leading experts on that whole subject. So there's all these intermeshing circles, and there's this whole who's going to grab the ring of power. And so it's become this whole idea of intellect and will, as Tomberg was trying to describe there. So what we have to do, the greatest thing that we can do, is find our hearts and dedicate them to that Christ impulse, that living Christ impulse, that he came to earth. He's here now. He is present. He said, I shall be with you to the ends of the earth. And so he's already here. If we don't notice it, it's not on him, it's on us, because he wishes for us to come to him out of perfect freedom. And so that's a lot to think about, I know, but that's kind of what it takes to get behind some of the things that we like to discuss here. And but that being said, Reverend David here is responsible for the authorship of 3 books. The first one is The Grammar of Witchcraft, which is a Shakespearean study and not a grimoire. And his second book is Shakespearean as Poetry, Caliban's Redemption. And his major work is Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, edited by the very talented Daniela Hadi Irndust. And Daniela has a book of his own on Waldorf education. That's On the Philosophy of Education Towards an Anthroposophic View. All of these books are available on Amazon. You can even get a free digital version of Daniela's book. It's a very interesting take on Waldorf education that takes into consideration some of the more modern schools of thought that tend to swirl around academia these days. And as for myself, and you can also, if you want to get David a cup of coffee, that's paypal.me/dparry777. And for myself, I have two books. This first book's out of print, reprinting. I hope I can get it together sooner rather than later. But The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. Yeah, with a foreword by my best buddy, Douglas Gabriel, extensive text and diagrams based on Aaron Pfeiffer's hand-drawn diagrams across my desk many years ago, and I added a great many more. And then in my second volume, I added even more. And my second volume is The Arcana of Light on the Path, as a foreword by William Bento, the noted astronomer and psychologist. And but the Grail diagrams are really key in understanding certain principles that we tend to discuss in this circle. And so these are available, or at least the second one is still available on eBay directly from me. And or if you're outside the US, you can order them by contacting me privately through a private message on Facebook, or there's an academia link below, and you can click on that, and that'll take you to my academia page, and you can download the foreword by William Bento, which is very nicely written, for free. You can download it for free through the academia link. And if you want to buy me a cup of coffee, that's paypal.me/D. Wait a minute, that's his name. PayPal.me/John Barnwell 888. And so I guess everything is everything. But in getting to this particular opportunity, I also like to thank people that have contributed. Most of them are contributed in the past by buying a book or whatever, but I read off this list of names. Probably people think that like all these people are contributing to me all the time, and no, that's not true. But I just like to be thankful. But nonetheless, there are people that have given me continual support, and that this podcast has been possible by the generous support of Tyler and Douglas and Vadim and Vivian and Tim and Neil and a short list of other people that includes amongst them Ray and Whitney and James and Marilyn and so many others over the years. And I guess it has been years. That's something, to do anything for years. But thank you. And thank you again, because again, without those individuals mentioned, I don't know if I could have pulled this off. And even still, it's getting a little dicey. But if each one of you, no amount is too small, it would help me keep this ship afloat. And now I think I'd like to pass it to Reverend David. He's looking a little overwrought here. You know, it tends to happen when he has to do a service before the show. So if you want to say something, by all means, and then lead us in a prayer.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I mean, the first two Sundays of the month tend to be very, I'm 64, tend to be very, very demanding indeed. I mean, the reason this show on the first Sunday of the month is half an hour later is because I literally have to hot foot it from our chapel, which is struggling to keep its doors open, back to do this show. And I confess, you know, I mean, I'm the minister there, so you've got to do everything with my other half. I couldn't do it without him, but you know, it's draining. inspiring but draining. If you put your heart and soul into something because you love it, I humbly suggest you can't do that hour in and hour out. You need a bit of a rest, but there isn't a rest before this show, and I rather like doing my best with this show too, not only because I respect John Barnwell, but because we're saying something quite important. And John Barnwell's my chum, so you know, the win-win-win situation. I confess what we're trying to do, of course, is also partly Gnostic. I think Valentinian Gnosticism should never have been expelled from the Catholic fold. And I'm beginning to wonder if it actually was officially. Remember, there's more than one type of Catholicism. Although on one level that doesn't matter, because if Rome has decided it's on its hit list, then the others will be really cautious about saying or doing anything. But clearly that was a major error, something deeply offensive to the spirit. Valentinianism and Valentinus should never have been excluded from the church in the manner that they were. And of course, if one looks back at the history, while Valentinus was still alive, they actually didn't do that. In fact, when he lost the papacy, going to be the Bishop of Rome is coyly put that way nowadays. It means becoming Pope. When he didn't achieve that, because there were all sorts of nastinesses entering the church at that particular time, and they weren't really as interested as they were in deeply spiritual people. They wanted people like machine minders or avaricious bastards to take over the organization. So it didn't do well for a sort of humble yoga teacher, as we put it nowadays. So we try and explore Valentinianism in the context of Catholicism. That itself keeps me on my toes, as you can imagine. What I do on the second Sunday of the month is the online Persian Christian Fellowship, which blesses me and graces me by including me on their list of ministers. That is a sort of monthly gig as well. Much more mainstream in our discussions than anything we do here. For the simple reason that, you know, obviously there are linguistic problems. Not everybody speaks perfect English. And shame on me for not having better Farsi. You know, but so you have to keep things basically much more churchy than I tend to do in my own services, or indeed on this show. Otherwise, you'd get nowhere. So yes, both of those Sundays I look frayed. I'm looking frayed at the moment. I confess that. In terms of something I do need to say, I mean, it's been on my mind because John keeps mentioning abstract thought as a real peril, which, by the way, I 100% agree with. I think some people get the wrong impression that if I'm not speaking with gusto about something John said, I'm either in two minds about it or I don't agree. Sometimes we don't agree. But that actually isn't one of those times. I agree with him 100%. It worries me immensely that particularly in the church, Valentinian notions like the knowledge of the heart, what is Christianity, what is Catholicism really about, a knowledge of the heart, can be so easily swept away. You know, we have to remember, if somebody went back to the days of Valentinus, not only would he have been Father Valentinus, he wouldn't have known what you were talking about if you'd have said he was a Gnostic. He'd have said he was a Catholic. And he would have thought that that type of knowledge, this is the 2nd century, was already going missing. It was going missing from church. My God, little did he know what would happen after that. And, you know, John is entirely right. That's what we need back. We need it back as a church. We need it back in all of our faith communities. We've got to my mind, stop being so pleased with this sort of, I don't know, schoolmen need to score points and win, you know, win at arguments and, you know, clobber, what do they clobber verses? I mean, this is childish. Point one, at the end of the day, you're responsible to God alone, not the church. Point two, to our neighbours, pull the beam out of thine own eye. And what we're meant to be doing is becoming a loving community, looking after each other and building and developing our relationships, not this sort of juridical court of assize which always fights for the prosecution before the case has even begun. It's time for Christianity to remember the basics, and that's not that old-time religion which the Southern Baptists like talking about so much. And with deep respect to them, and they've had some remarkable people come out of their fold recently, including, of course, Martin Luther King. The old-time religion is the knowledge of the heart. That's what it is. I think the Baptists, I love having a go at Baptists because I'm half a Baptist myself. I can see what they're doing and why they're doing it. And they're men and women of great faith and great will. When you start talking about will, I mean, that's the one thing the Steiners, the Crowleys, the Gurdjieffs of the world will all agree about. Magic has something to do with the will. It has magical properties. And when will and faith come together, that's when old-time religion, in the sense the religion of the apostles, starts to make itself known. Let's get back to that again. Oh, by the way, before I go into the prayer, one last point. No, I don't hate everyone in the Bible Belt, which somebody said to me recently. I've actually got good friends in the Bible Belt. What I don't like are the excesses, and when I think certain groups are letting themselves down. All that faith and all that striving to try and lead a life of grace can only be applauded. It can only be inspirational and inspired. And just because people go wrong doesn't mean they're condemned as a group and per se, because what is behind all of that is laudable, and we're all human. So I take my own medicine and my own advice in not criticizing beyond a certain point, because I'm very, very aware that most of the churches and most of the groups that would include themselves under that epithet are actually more than half decent, big-hearted human beings who are trying their best to approach the Holy Spirit. Who can floor that? Which leads me into the prayer. It's very difficult coming up with an extempore prayer for this show. It's very difficult consulting a list of prayers, be they poetic or be they in one of the missals. It's very hard to pray for people on this show. It's very hard to pray for our listeners, for the people who comment, for John, because we're a living community. We're not simply people that turn up for a gladiatorial spectacle. Some podcasts are like that. We're not simply people who want to keep our mouths shut and let the experts on the screen right all the wrongs of the world. That's not what we are. We too are looking for inspired thoughts and open hearts. We're learning to share our knowledge and our experience with each other, which is why I often lapse into the metaphor of church or synagogue or mosque for this show. That's what we are. And that's something to be proud of. My friends, we've reached 100th episode. We are family. I don't agree that family is by blood alone. That can go horribly wrong, like everything else. I do agree we're family if we're looking after each other's interests, supporting each other, maintaining each other's faith, and empowering each other on the road ahead. Therefore, I pray humbly at the bottom of my heart that the Christ energy and the Christ light will be with you in the ever-warming hearts within your breasts, in the expanding minds in your skulls, in each relationship you are blessed with, and in the future that we walk into from this moment onwards. May everybody be blessed by angels until we meet again. Amen.
Amen. That was a nice prayer. So people who see this, please share it and click like. That's also helpful. And I want to thank Pastor David and everybody for showing up for another wonderful Sunday event.